Chapter 7, Expansion and Division. Part 2, Texas Independence. Anglos to Texas. Texas, or Texas, was originally a sparsely settled northern portion of New Spain. In 1821, there was a general revolt of the Hispanic population, the so-called Mexican War of Independence, against the authorities back in Spain, which resulted eventually in the creation of the Republic of Mexico 2 years later. The huge northern region was so sparsely settled that two huge regions were formed into the single state of Coahuila y Texas. The Comanche Indians were a constant problem to the Hispanic settlers, and the decision was made in 1824 to encourage European and Americans to settle in the area. This had already been happening on a small scale, as in the case of the impresario Stephen Austin, bringing some 300 Americans to settle along the Brazos River in 1822, and with this decision a large number of others, mostly Americans, were settled in Texas under a number of similar impresarios. Finally, the influx of Americans was so overwhelming in numbers that in 1830 Mexican President Bustamante closed the borders to further immigration. Footnote. At the beginning of the migration in 1825, there were only about 3,500 settlers in Texas, mostly Hispanic. Less than 10 years later, that figure was over 10 times that size, about 80% of them Americans, with a substantial number of slaves among them. The move to independence. But the American immigrants, sensing the Mexican effort to isolate them, fought back, at the same time that a revolt against the Mexican president was taking place in the Mexican capital. Taking advantage of the political chaos and supporting the party of Mexican Federalists fighting the Mexican Centralists, Texans gathered at the convention of 1832 to discuss the option of independent statehood. The spirit of independence was thus birthed in Texas. The Battle of Gonzales and the Consultation, 1835. When in 1835 a small Mexican military contingent was sent north to crush this spirit, a similarly small group of Texans fought the Mexicans to a standoff at the Battle of Gonzales, merely strengthening the desire of the Texans to achieve independence. They gathered that same year, the Consultation, declaring their reasons for seeking independence and setting up a provisional government and general council. They also established a Texas Army under Sam Houston. But political controversy immediately plagued the new government, which collapsed in early 1836. However, another gathering that spring produced quickly a formal Declaration of Independence, March the 2nd, 1836, and the announcement of the creation of the Republic of Texas. The massacres at the Alamo and Goliad, March of 1836. The Alamo. At the same time, the new Mexican president and military caudillo, or strongman, Antonio López de Santa Anna, had already headed north with the intention of crushing this Texas rebellion. Santa Anna's 4,000 troops surrounded the Alamo mission near San Antonio. Finally, after a siege of almost 2 weeks, overwhelming the 187 defenders on March the 6th, killing all of them to the last man. But in fact, it was quite a Pyrrhic victory, costing Santa Anna the loss of over 2/3 of his army in dead and wounded. Goliad. At about the same time, another large Mexican army began to move north from Matamoros, overwhelming small Texas units as they went. In mid-March, a larger Texas unit confronted the Mexicans in 3 days of fighting, before the Texas unit gave out of ammunition and were surrounded and forced to surrender as they attempted to retreat. The Texans were marched back to Fort Defiance in Goliad, Then, under the orders of Santa Anna, the Mexican troops proceeded to massacre over 300 of these prisoners. That was on March the 27th. But rather than breaking the spirit of the Texans, the event merely steeled their determination to secure Texas independence at all costs. Ultimately, both events produced the Texas battle cry, "Remember the Alamo," and "Remember Goliad." Texas victory at San Jacinto, April 1836. The next month, Sam Houston and his Texas Army joined battle with Santa Anna, April the 21st, at San Jacinto. That 20-minute battle turned out to be a disaster for Santa Anna, who was captured, disguised as a servant in an effort to escape, and 630 of his soldiers killed. Only 9 Texans died in the battle. At this point, Santa Anna had no choice but to sign a peace treaty with the victors, withdrawing his forces from a newly independent Texas Republic. But Santa Anna would immediately repudiate the treaty once he was safely out of Texas. The debate over Texas joining the Union, 1837 to 1845. Almost immediately, 1837, a split occurred within the leadership of the Texas Republic, between those wishing to retain and expand Texas as an independent republic, possibly extending its borders all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and those who wanted to see Texas annexed as a new state, joining the United States. The debate was finally decided in favor of the annexation group when Mexico sent troops back up into Texas and had to be fought off with much difficulty. This seemed to establish in Texan minds the importance of being closely connected to the greater power of the United States. But Texas allowed slavery, stirring debate within the United States itself as to whether or not Texas ought to be admitted as a new slave state. President Van Buren did not want the slave issue to work its political damage at a time when he was struggling with the economic panic of 1837, and so he tried to hold off the issue of Texas admission throughout his entire 4-year tenure as president. Also, he did not want to find the country at war with Mexico, which had never accepted the idea of the independence of Texas. But he faced a lot of adversity from Southerners, especially from Calhoun, who was making an issue of the South's willingness to stay in the Union if Texas were not admitted. But opposing Calhoun was John Quincy Adams, who had returned to Washington after his presidency to become a very powerful voice in the House of Representatives, and who spoke for 3 weeks in opposition to the admission of Texas.